Welcome back to All Sorts Podcast. We love exploring what makes us human. And today, we'll think about those times you see someone who needs help. What is it that makes us jump in sometimes, and other times maybe we hesitate or, even look away? We're going to dig into that today. We're looking at altruism, that selfless drive to help, and also the bystander effect, that weird thing where, like, the more people around, the less likely anyone is to actually do something. We've pulled together some really interesting stuff to try and understand this core part of being human. The goal, as always, is to get you the key info without, grounding you in details. So let's get started. First up, altruism, that urge to help.
Right. And when we think about altruism day to day, it's usually someone helping someone else who's, in a tough spot. Think about emergency services like firefighters or paramedics. A lot of people go into those jobs specifically because they want to help people. They want to make a difference. One source we looked at from Firehouse Magazine really highlights this. It's a strong sense of public service that pulls people in. They get real satisfaction from helping.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense, that initial motivation. But does it last? Does that feeling stick around over a whole career? Because that Firehouse piece raised a really important point. Sometimes, for some people, it fades. The day-to-day grind, seeing bad outcomes sometimes, maybe that personal reward feeling just decreases. So that leads to the big question. How do you keep that altruism alive? Especially in zones like firefighting that are so demanding long-term.
Yeah, that's crucial. And the article has some good ideas. Things like regular recognition, making sure people know the positive impact they're having. It doesn't have to be huge things either. Small acknowledgments, maybe sharing positive stories internally or even, on social media sometimes, that can really reinforce the purpose. Think about how you feel when someone acknowledges your work, right?
Yeah.
Give you a boost.
Definitely. And here's something else interesting from that piece. It mentioned opportunities for growth, like promotions. The idea being that moving up can keep people engaged, keep that sense of purpose strong, connects back to why they joined. But it also brought up the flip side. Sometimes senior people stay in their roles for a really long time, which might block opportunities for younger firefighters coming up.
Yeah, that's a classic organizational challenge, isn't it? Balancing experience and new energy. The article floated an interesting idea, though. Maybe encourage experienced folks to retire, but then bring them back, perhaps as mentors or educators. That way the next generation gets their chance, but you don't lose all that valuable wisdom.
That actually sounds like a really smart way to handle it, a cycle of growth. Okay, so let's switch gears a bit. Let's look at altruism from a totally different angle. Biology. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy had some really fascinating stuff on this.
Oh, absolutely. Biologically speaking, altruism means something quite specific. It's behavior that helps another organism, but comes at a cost to your own reproduction. So it might lower your own expected number of offspring. And importantly, this definition doesn't require any conscious thought or intention. It's all about the fitness consequences.
Right. But hang on, if evolution is all about, survival of the fittest individual, how does something like altruism evolve? If it puts the individual at a disadvantage, seems like it shouldn't happen.
That's the million-dollar question in evolutionary biology. And one early thought was group selection. The idea that maybe groups with more altruists just did better overall than groups full of selfish individuals, even if the altruists within the group weren't doing as well personally. But what's gained more traction are ideas like kin selection and inclusive fitness.
Kin selection. That's helping your relatives, right? Because they share your genes.
Exactly. If you help your relatives survive and reproduce, you're indirectly helping to pass on the genes you share with them, including potentially any genes that might influence altruistic behavior itself. And the closer the relative, like a sibling versus a cousin, the stronger this effect is, statistically speaking.
Okay, so it's not like you're consciously thinking, I must help my brother pass on our shared genes. It's more about the genes that lead to that helping behavior becoming more common because they benefit copies of themselves and relatives.
Precisely. The key, as W.D. Hamilton pointed out, is some kind of statistical link, a positive correlation between the one doing the helping and the one receiving it. Kinship is the most obvious way that happens, but there could be other ways too, like if altruists somehow tend to hang out together more often.
That makes me think of the prisoner's dilemma game.
Yes, exactly. It's a good simple model. In a one-off game, being selfish is often the best bet for you individually. But if altruists are somehow more likely to interact with other altruists, maybe because they recognize each other or cluster together, then altruism can actually pay off in the long run.
The Stanford source also talked about strong versus weak altruism. What's that distinction?
Good question. Strong altruism is costly for the helper and benefits the recipient. Weak altruism actually benefits both the helper and the recipient, maybe just to different degrees. And interestingly, weak altruism can evolve more easily, even without that strong correlation between helper and recipient we just talked about.
Gotcha. And then there's reciprocal altruism, the whole I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine idea.
Right. That one requires repeated interactions. You help someone now, expecting they might help you later. And you need to be able to recognize individuals and remember past interactions so you know who owes you one, basically. The tit-for-tat strategy in the iterated prisoner's dilemma is a great example. You start nice, cooperate, and then just copy what the other player did last time. It's simple, but really effective at fostering cooperation.
Okay, but hearing all this about genes and strategies, does it kind of take away from what we think of as real altruism? Genuine, intentional selflessness?
That's a really common reaction.
Yeah.
But the Stanford Encyclopedia is careful here. Biological altruism is defined by the fitness outcome, the effect on reproduction, not the motivation. The whole selfish gene idea, it's a powerful metaphor for how genes associated with successful traits spread. It doesn't mean the organism is consciously selfish when it helps a relative or expects reciprocation. Our motivations can be quite separate.
Right. So evolution might explain some underlying tendencies, maybe especially towards kin or those we expect to interact with again. But humans, we're complicated, aren't we? Culture, conscious thought, empathy, they play huge roles too. Things like adopting unrelated children, for example. That doesn't fit neatly into simple kin selection or reciprocity models.
Exactly. Human behavior is way more layered. And that brings us nicely to the brain. What's actually going on up there when we act altruistically? Neuroscience has some really cool insights.
Okay, yeah, let's hear about the brain on kindness.
Well, research shows pretty clear patterns. Specific brain areas light up. You've got parts of the limbic system like the nucleus accumbens, the anterior cingulate cortex. These are involved in reward processing. And then cortical areas too, like the medial prefrontal cortex, the temporoparietal junction. These are big players in what we call mentalizing or theory of mind, basically, understanding other people's thoughts and feelings.
So it feels good to help, like a reward, and we're using the parts of our brain that help us figure out what someone else needs or feels.
That seems to be a big part of it, yes. A review in PubMed Central really digs into this. The reward areas, VTA, striatum, ACC, they get active, suggesting altruism can be inherently rewarding. That warm glow feeling people talk about, and that mentalizing network, MPFC, TPJ, is crucial for figuring out the other person's state, their intentions, their emotions. You need that to help effectively.
What about, like, controlling our own reactions or feeling empathy when someone's upset?
Good point. Other regions are involved there too. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex helps with cognitive control, like focusing attention and deciding what to do. The amygdala is key for picking up on emotional cues, especially distress signals. And the insula is heavily involved in our own emotional experience, including feeling empathy for someone else's pain or distress.
The research mentions studies on donating to charity. What did they find specifically there?
When the donation involves a personal cost, like giving away your own money, areas like the anterior prefrontal cortex get involved. General donations, even if not costly, seem to activate those reward circuits, the VTA striatum, kind of like receiving money. But interestingly, a specific part, the subgenual ACC, SGACC, seems particularly active during those costly donations. It suggests maybe a mix of reward and genuine concern for the other person driving the decision.
Okay. And what about physically helping someone? Or say stepping in if someone's being treated unfairly, like punishing someone who's cheating?
There's research on that too. Both helping someone directly and punishing someone who acted unfairly seem to activate the striatum again, that reward connection. But the pathways look a bit different. Helping seems to involve more communication between the right lateral prefrontal cortex and the striatum, whereas punishment involved more connection with the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the left lateral prefrontal cortex. And importantly, people who scored higher on measures of empathic concern showed more activity in frontoparietal areas when they decided to help.
Wow, so empathy really seems wired into the decision to help. You mentioned how we perceive the person needing help matters too, like if they're one of us or an outsider.
Yes, that's a critical factor. One study looked at brain activity when people saw members of their own group versus an outgroup member in pain. Seeing your own group member in pain activated the anterior insula, that empathy region, but seeing an outgroup member in pain For some people, especially those who already had negative views of that group, it activated the nucleus accumbens the reward area.
Wait, seriously, a reward feeling from seeing someone you dislike in pain, that's pretty disturbing.
It is. It suggests that group identity and prejudice can drastically alter even these basic neural responses to suffering.
Now, you also mentioned a study on extreme altruist people who donate kidneys to strangers. What was different about their brains?
Yeah, fascinating study. They found these individuals had increased activity in the right amygdala and the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex when looking at fearful faces. They also tended to have a physically larger right amygdala and were better at recognizing fear in others compared to controls. The idea is that maybe they have a heightened sensitivity to other people's distress signals, which could drive their extraordinary willingness to help.
So being more attuned to fear, maybe feeling it more strongly yourself when you see it in others, could lead to much greater altruism. Makes a kind of sense. Okay, one last angle on altruism before we switch topics. This connection to risk-taking. That sounds kind of backward at first.
It does, doesn't it? But it's an interesting idea from a recent IZA discussion paper. The argument is that being altruistic might actually make you more willing to take risks in certain situations, specifically if taking a risk has a potential payoff that would really benefit the person you're trying to help.
How does that work exactly?
Well, the paper uses a mathematical model, basically showing that someone focused on maximizing the well-being of another person, the altruist, might be less risk-averse than someone only focused on themselves. The potential big win for the other person might outweigh the personal risk involved in the gamble,
Huh. That's really counterintuitive, but interesting. So, caring about someone else could make you bolder, in a way, if the stakes are high for them. The paper also touches on, kidney donation again, how the risk involved might relate to how much society values the act. And that even in one-off situations, evolution can sometimes favor cooperation if there's kinship or maybe a chance of future interactions.
Exactly. Lots of complex factors feeding into this. Which brings us nicely to the other side of the coin, the bystander effect. We've talked a lot about why we do help. Now let's look at why sometimes we don't.
Right, the bystander effect. That really unsettling finding that if there's an emergency, the more people watching, the less likely any one person is to actually step up and help. It feels like it goes against everything we just discussed about altruism.
It does seem like a paradox, yeah. There was a huge review, a meta-analysis published back in 2011 that looked at tons of studies on this, going way back to the 60s. They crunched the numbers from lots and lots of different experiments and participants.
And what was the bottom line? Is the bystander effect a real consistent thing?
Overwhelmingly, yes. The analysis found a clear, statistically significant pattern. People are less likely to help when others are present compared to when they're alone. The effect is definitely real. But, and this is important, they also found situations where the effect gets weaker or even disappears completely. Factors that make people more likely to help, even in a crowd.
Okay, so it's not inevitable. What pushes us to act despite the crowd? What breaks the spell, so to speak?
One really big factor is how dangerous the situation seems. The review found that in clearly dangerous emergencies, people were actually more likely to help than in ambiguous or less dangerous ones, which kind of fits the idea that high danger snaps you out of uncertainty. It feels like a real emergency, gets your adrenaline going, and you're more likely to act.
Right. The ambiguity melts away when it's clearly serious. What else?
Well, if there's a clear perpetrator involved, someone causing the harm, that also increased helping. Also, if the potential costs of helping were physical risks, rather than just, say, time or embarrassment, that seemed to motivate action more. A couple other interesting ones. If the bystanders were all men, helping was more likely. And if the other bystanders seemed naive, like genuinely unsure what to do, rather than being actors just standing passively. Oh, and the big one. If the bystanders knew each other. Familiarity definitely reduced the bystander effect. You're more likely to act if you know the people around you.
Okay, so clear danger, a bad guy present, physical stakes, maybe an all-male group, others seeming unsure too, and knowing the people you're with. Those things can push back against that diffusion of responsibility. It really shows how the specifics matter, doesn't it? The situation, who's there, and it ties right back to altruism, right? These factors are kind of like switches that can either block or enable that basic helping instinct.
Precisely. So when you pull it all together, you see, altruism isn't simple. It's this mix of evolution, brain wiring, personal feelings, the situation right in front of you. And the bystander effect is this stark reminder that sometimes the social situation itself can override our better impulses, even when someone really needs help.
Which leaves us with a pretty big question for us and for you listening. If we understand this better, how can we, consciously try to encourage more altruism in ourselves, in others, and how do we fight against that bystander freeze when it counts? Definitely something to think about.
It really is. And maybe that's the final thought for you, our listener. In a world that often feels kind of disconnected, understanding why we have this deep urge to help, but also what stops us, that seems more important than ever. How can we actively create the conditions in our own lives and communities that let that better, more helpful part of ourselves step forward? How do we encourage ourselves and each other to act, even when it's maybe easier not to?
Dear listener, if this journey into why we help or why we hesitate has sparked something in you, a question, maybe an insight, then please keep that spark alive with us at the All Sorts podcast. Think of your subscription on YouTube like planting a seed of connection. It helps our community of curious minds grow. Share this deep dive if it resonated. Let the ideas ripple out. Together, we can try to build a richer understanding of ourselves and the world. And there's so much more waiting for you in our archives. Explore past episodes of the All Sorts podcast. Each one is a different window onto something fascinating. Follow our journey on X, see our visual takes on Instagram, and join the conversation on Threads. Just search All Sorts podcast wherever you get your audio. Your engagement, your listening, your sharing. That's what fuels us. It lets us keep creating these deep dives, exploring the things that matter, hopefully, to you.